Hello, my name is Dr. Richard Bargdill. I am an associate professor of psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University. And today, Anthony Muron, former VCU student in psychology, is going to talk a little bit about gentrification. And so take it away, Anthony.
All right, greetings. My name is Anthony Muron. I'm a VCU graduate of the psychology program in 2014. And we're going to talk a little bit about gentrification and displacement, as well as economic development within urban communities. Now, before we begin, let me just introduce by asking real quick, what is gentrification? The word began to appear pretty regularly in American conversation about a decade ago. And the reasoning why it wasn't talked about on a day-to-day dialogue in earlier years of American history is pretty convoluted. There are a number of definitions of gentrification. In the most general sense, it is thought of as the economic stimulation of an urban area fueled by new businesses and residences. In this presentation, we're gonna dive into the root of displacement as it occurs in the United States and reveal some of the opportunities and consequences that financial progress has on the American public. From the subprime real estate crisis of 2008 until the present moment, the economic boom affects the lives of hardworking Americans of all demographics in both positive and negative ways. While the money flows into the economy through massive real estate corporations, detrimental effects have played majority African-American communities, many of which originally settled after the post-Civil War migrations escaping the Jim Crow South, up until the point where redlining continued the trend of segregation that kept communities and people in the trap of poverty. With this said, there are still many proponents to growing real estate conglomerates and development that also have negative side effects on established communities, as well as positive side effects on the communities that are continuing to grow there. We're going to talk about some of these idealists who claim that the forced integration of mixed income residents is a good thing that brings down crime and feeds the economy with money. This is going to be compared to opinions of those who have been displaced from communities where folks have to work sometimes 2, even 3 jobs in order to meet the average income needed to continue affording an increasing rent. And in conclusion, we're going to talk about positive holistic ways that communities can join forces to prevent displacement from the bottom up, and how governments can create anti-racist policy in order to protect longtime residents who have been affected by racist policy in the past. And finally, we'll talk to Dr. Richard Bargdill and discuss the psychological effects of gentrification and the role that psychologists play in our current state, as well as the future livelihoods of people affected by the detriments of displacement. So our story begins in the early 1900s and late 1800s, when there was a migration of Black folks from the South to the North to larger cities, escaping the Jim Crow era after the end of the Civil War. Right at the end of the Civil War, Black men were given voting rights. And as a protest, many of the white men who opposed the end of slavery refused to vote. Therefore, there was a surge of African-American men that were voted into elected positions. Soon after that, there were a number of policies and legislations that were implemented in order to prevent this, right? And this is where, essentially, in a nutshell, Jim Crow comes from. In this blowback, business owners and politicians realized their opportunities for economic advancement through cheap labor and indentured servitude would come to a close. So racist policy was implemented in order to stop this from happening. So while Black Americans were forcibly removed from trains, and state lines were closed in order to prevent people from moving north. Eventually, there were still a large number of people that made it to the north, populating the cities such as Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C. And the Jim Crow South prevailed for many years. But inevitably, through the economic freedom that was created by the ending of slavery, there were a number of Black Americans that ended up making it towards an economic freedom. Let's take Tulsa, Oklahoma, for example. Especially in light of more recent events in American history, people are beginning to understand the significance of the Greenwood Massacre. In the 1910s and 20s, the oil boom hit the Midwest very hard. Many Americans typically see the stereotypical oil tycoon as portrayed as an old white man with a mustache until they learn about the domineering Black population that benefited very heavily in Tulsa, Oklahoma, from this oil boom, which created jobs and other industries within the area. So the white population in the Midwest saw this as a threat. They saw many Black communities in the still segregated areas benefiting very widely. One day in mid-1921, a Black man was accused of assaulting a white woman, and it soon escalated to a full-fledged race riot in Greenwood. Before any kind of massacre could be prevented, the white mob burnt down some 150 Black-owned businesses, along with hospitals, schools, churches, and homes. And the Black community in Tulsa never recovered. This is an incredible amount of capital that was in the Black community that essentially was halted, stopped. It ceased to continue. This did not only happen in Tulsa, it happened in many other cities around the US. And there was a tampering of Black wealth within the United States so that it was very difficult to create capital within Black communities. So let's fast forward a little bit to 1934 and talk about the Federal Housing Administration. It was created to give middle class and lower middle class folks opportunity to own houses. There was a huge housing shortage. So the federal government created this policy in order to build homes and put middle class families in homes. Now, after this legislation was enacted, independent organizations, which included banks along with insurance companies, were put in charge of drawing lines within these communities so that these communities would be given loans or not. Essentially what happened was lines were physically drawn along white neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods as a form of risk management. Once these lines were drawn, it was pretty easy to tell that they were drawn between the Black and white communities. There were a few different colors that they used on the maps based on the risk management. For example, the blue lines would be low risk for giving loans. The red lines would be high risk for giving loans. So typically banks didn't touch communities that were on the other side of that red line, hence the name redlining. This lasted for decades, and it again crippled the African American community so that that capital was unable to be built. In this case, the capital was in the form of credit. Because these folks weren't able to gain credit, they weren't able to be given loans, and it was a spiral that continued to affect these communities, especially in larger cities, pretty much causing people, predominantly Black folks, not to be able to buy houses, right? So it was a cycle of renting, and these landlords were essentially able to do whatever they wanted to with their tenants, similar to what happens today in America. Eventually, in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was created, which made loan discrimination illegal. Of course, there are always ways around laws. So it was still possible to discriminate someone that was seeking a loan based on who they were, what their ethnicity was, and what their race was. Again, by this time, the credit of many Black families were affected, and entire communities were crippled because of this. 1968 was a really important year. That was the year that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And because of this, the pent-up rage of the African-American community was finally let out, and there were riots all over the US. Because of this, there was a white flight. Many of the white businesses in the large cities of America decided to divest from America, from American cities, rather. And the capital within the cities that those businesses were creating essentially vanished in the course of a year. Again, crippling these African-American communities whose businesses, some of which were burnt to the ground, others were divested in by the community. They ended up losing capital and were not able to continue business within the cities. This had crippling effects. Again, that's a word that I'm going to use a lot, crippling effects within these communities. Fast forward a little bit into the 70s and eventually to the late 80s when the crack epidemic hit. Instead of treating this as a health crisis, the government treated it as a criminal crisis. And eventually in the mid-90s, the minimum sentence for any possession of crack was 5 years, which led to a mass incarceration of African-American men, predominantly, and also women, which separated families and continued to batter the communities of African Americans in an already crippled market and economy. Let's fast forward a little bit to 2008. This is when the crisis of the economy in the United States started to trickle over into white families pretty heavily. As we all know, and many of us experienced, the subprime mortgage market crash in 2008 was the cause of large financial institutions pretty much legally being able to convince the middle class Americans to take out subprime mortgages on their homes, essentially gambling their home's equity. Pretty much what happened was the mortgage was backed by hedge funds and banks. Since the market was unregulated, the interest rates were originally very low. And once the government raised these interest rates, they rose significantly. People weren't able to pay this extra interest rate that was forced upon them. Therefore, they lost their homes. And the banks owned this very significant amount of homes in America, leading to a mass eviction of Americans who had no way of paying back these high interest rates. Now, there are a number of psychological effects to this. Depression and anxiety became rampant, and antidepressant drug use was increased significantly, right? So that's a little bit of the history, all right? All the way from the 1860s until modern day, you can see a trend of how American policy really was a result of many people of color, especially Black folks in the United States, not being able to gain that capital in order to own houses. So now, in our present day, it's a renter's market, especially in the inner cities, urban areas. People are forced to rent their houses rather than own. Some lucky folks were able to continue renting, they were able to buy houses. But the majority of people had to continue renting because they were never able to gain that credit through loans in order to buy these houses. So let's talk about a little bit about what's happening nowadays, going back to gentrification. Something that I like to call a reverse white flight, if you will. Beginning in the late 1970s, the US began what they like to call urban renewal, um, which essentially was the idea of bringing capital back into urban settings that were essentially divested from and decimated uh, in the late 60s and early 70s. But there's a little bit of a social issue here. The majority of people moving back into these cities are young, affluent, predominantly white folks. There's a diverse mixture of people moving into the cities, but it is statistically predominantly white. Why is this? It goes back to the history of people not being able to buy credit and purchase homes. You have young Americans, mostly college graduates, moving into these cities with expendable income, or moving into these cities and getting jobs with a very decent income. And essentially what's happening is they're forcing longtime residents of these urban cities out. Now, how is this possible? Well, it's pretty easily in the system of economic incentives that we have. Pretty much what happens is if a tenant is renting a house and the landlord wants to renovate that house and sell it to someone who has a higher income, they could renovate the house and sell it for sometimes even double its value. So you have these communities within inner city America that have low income and middle income Americans with high income Americans moving in, which is essentially the cause for the increase of the median income. When the median income increases, the housing values increase, the rents go up. People can't pay their rents and they're forced to leave, move elsewhere, to somewhere on the outskirts of the city or to live with family somewhere else in the United States. So how do landlords do this? It's an interesting question that's kind of plagued me for quite some time. So for the past year and a half, I've really been looking into it, talking to a few folks that have been living in these communities their entire lives. First, let's talk about housing discrimination. There are a few types of housing discriminations that happen that are in many cities still legal. First, sometimes landlords, in order to create a more secure feeling of economic gain, will make sure that the person that's moving into their house is of the standard hierarchy of American social society. Wealthy, affluent, white. This isn't always the case, but many times it's a red flag. It can be seen as a red flag to many landlords to hire someone that doesn't have citizenship. And that is discrimination. Citizenship requirements are a form of housing discrimination that happen in America on a daily basis. The second type is sexual orientation. Many times housing and urban developers won't, predominantly landlords won't allow people of different sexual orientations, predominantly surgery plus minorities, to move into houses based off solely their sexual orientation, right? And the third one's a little bit more arbitrary. It comes in the form of housing vouchers. Now, what are housing vouchers? Housing vouchers are essentially, not always, but typically given to someone who is incentivized to move out of their house and be located to another location. Let's say you have a housing complex, whether it be Section 8 or not, that is in a prime location, right, for the development of the economy, gentrified location, if you will. The people throughout the building are given these housing vouchers and told that they have a certain amount of time to leave, right? Landlords can sometimes do this legally and sometimes they do it illegally. Sometimes they confuse the tenant into believing that they don't have the right to stay in that house when they actually do. So what the government's done in many cities around the US is create these housing vouchers in order to give to the tenants so that they can move to another place in the city or out of the city that accepts these housing vouchers that are worth a certain amount of money every month. But it's a form of discrimination because not every place accepts housing vouchers. In fact, there are a number of only limited places that accept these housing vouchers. So talking to an anonymous resident in Washington, D.C., they were given a housing voucher, forced to leave their apartment complex, and given a number of options to move to. They ended up moving to a place in Virginia and ended up seeing the same people that they lived with in their previous housing complex. Now, this is a problem because essentially the fabric of these communities is being ripped to shreds. The entire culture, the entire community is essentially vanishing under this displacement, which has very negative side effects psychologically on families in general. Once these communities are separated, this support system is taken away from under these folks, which can certainly lead to detrimental psychological effects, and eventually could possibly lead to certain forms of mental illness within these new communities. So a lot of times these developers and communities will create these mixed income housing. They'll give a housing voucher, tell the family to move away for 5 years, use the housing voucher, and then sometimes they'll be given the opportunity to come back. It's much easier said than done. A lot of the times what happens is the family moves out of the house, sometimes has to leave their job because they're not close enough to it, and ends up creating unstable roots where they're living at, making them financially unable to move back to where they were originally living in the first place. So those are some forms of housing discrimination. A little bit wordy, but we're going to move a little bit further into other forms of housing discrimination that are a little bit more arbitrary. Now, some folks may argue that having a significant amount of vacant houses within a community is in no way a form of housing discrimination, but it could also be argued that it is. There are communities around the US, and there are a very significant amount of vacant homes. Many of these homes are vacant for various reasons. Either the person that was living in the family passed away and the bank now has the house. It could have been given to the family members. The family members don't want it. It could be vacant. A developer maybe bought a family out of their house, and the house is now vacant and waiting to be developed. There are a handful of reasons that houses could be vacant. But this is a problem because you have a number of people experiencing homelessness who are now without houses with a number of vacant houses. And this isn't good for the city. This isn't good for our society, right? That's a little bit more of a controversial issue because if you talk to a number of economists, they'll say, well, you have a vacant house, the person was bought out, or they foreclosed, they couldn't pay their mortgage, and now the house belongs to the bank. Many things in this process are illegal, right? But it's always important to remember that legality does not necessarily correlate to morality, right? Which leads me to my next point, vulnerable housing. We talked a little bit about people accepting housing vouchers in order to move out of a housing complex for real estate to come in and build more development, right? There are a number of vulnerable housing complexes within any given city. Typically, these are the housing projects that were created by the government for predominantly African Americans and people of color, when white Americans back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s were given the option to accept loans for houses that were outside of the city, leading to that first initial white flight. living in a vulnerable housing complex is not necessarily an easy life, especially if there aren't any organizations to back up that housing complex. It's very easy for a developer to come in to this vulnerable housing, buy the folks out, and displace them to another part of the city or another part of the US. Now that we've talked about our current state, let's talk a little bit about gentrification and displacement. Let's dissect it. We've talked a lot about like the detriments, and we've also talked about the economic side effects of it. Gentrification brings in affluent people that bring money into the local economy, and which eventually leads to a surplus of the government. On the surface, this is a good thing, but we have to think about people and the psychological detriment that happens when this happens to each individual in these cities. So one more time, we're going to talk about the proponents. The proponents will say economic development, safety, and diversity are the positive aspects of gentrification. Folks that have been displaced, or the opponents of gentrification, will say it raises the median income, which creates a difficulty for people to pay rent, and increases the housing values, which is a good thing for the economy, but a bad thing for people that are struggling to pay this rent. Let's remember that poverty is a trap. Poverty is expensive. The more poverty that you have, the more money you have to pay due to late fees, things of that nature, right? Let's say you're 3 months late on rent, or you're late on the electricity bill. They charge you for that. If you don't have the money to pay for it, the effects of that are compounding bills, right? So if you're an affluent person, you can pay your rent on time, you're able to gain capital a lot easier. If you're living in poverty, it's much more difficult to get out of that, because you continue this cycle, right? Which is very difficult to get out of. So let's go back to the opponents. The opponents of displacement. Raise the median income, making it difficult to pay rent. A lot of the proponents will say that safety is a result of gentrification. We see these communities that have been gentrified have less crime. But the opponents may say that safety is not a product of the gentrification. The lack of safety was a result of the lack of protections that the government gave to people that were living in these communities before the gentrification was even an issue. And we also talked about dismantling of people's culture and community due to people being forced out of these communities and new people that don't necessarily understand the culture moving into these communities. So let's focus briefly on the people that move into these communities. There are two basic terms that you can call people that move into communities that are not necessarily from the community. Gentrifiers and transplants. What is the difference between a gentrifier and a transplant? Rich, if you'd be able to share that screen with me, I'm going to briefly talk about what this difference looks like. Moving into a community as a transplant and moving into community as a gentrifier. Now, it's always important to remember that no one is ever 100% a transplant or 100% a gentrifier. It's always a spectrum, a mixture, right? So we talked about gentrification, hardcore gentrification, and the effects of that gentrification. But what makes a person a gentrifier instead of a transplant, right? On the spectrum, you can see that someone moving into a house or a condo that was once owned by a longtime resident, and then raising the equity on that house is essentially a gentrifier, right? Or renting a house that is no longer owned by a longtime DC resident, but someone else that may not even live in the city, right? Someone's making money off of another person moving into that house through rent, right? Let's talk a little bit about what a transplant is. It's a term that not too many people here, even when they know about gentrification. A transplant typically is someone who makes below the median income and becomes a community member within that community, continuing the tradition of that community, therefore becoming a link of that safety net within the community for the people that live in it. Okay. What are some aspects of being a transplant? One of the very basic aspects of transplantation rather than gentrification is knowing your neighbors on a personal level. Transplants are people who move into communities and get to know their neighbors on a personal level. They become friends with the neighbors, they help out the neighbors. They know what's going on in their community, right? Another aspect of being a transplant is volunteering in your local community. And I don't mean going to the food bank 1 hour every month. I mean actually volunteering with the local community churches, with the local rec center, the local community garden, what have you. These grassroots community organizations that are typically already established in many communities that really help out the community and give a positive effect to this community. And of course, as always in American society, there is a racial implication. BIPOC people, and if you're unfamiliar with the term BIPOC, it's Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? Black, Indigenous, or people of color, typically are automatically considered transplants rather than gentrifiers. Because these inner city communities were already, these low income inner city urban communities were already consisting of Black folks and people of color, it's important to remember that there are many cultural aspects of a BIPOC person moving into a community that continue the tradition, the cultural tradition of that community. When a white person moves to a community, and it's a community that was predominantly Black or is predominantly Black, there's automatically a at least mild sense of gentrification, because that culture of the community is automatically shifting, right, to what can be considered positive as a more diverse community, but also aspects of that community are lost, right, because they were predominantly Black before. Of course, a white person, if they're positive benefactors within their community, could move along the side of being a transplant, so long as their median income doesn't reach above the median income of the community that you live in. And I did want to make a very important note of becoming a community member, volunteering, and knowing neighbors at a personal level. When a person moves into the community, especially if they're white, it's always really important to be the followers of the community leaders rather than the leader of the community. So for example, me as a white man, if I move into a community that was predominantly Black in an urban setting, and I try to become the leader of tenants associations, become the leader of neighborhood advisory committees, things of that nature, that's not necessarily helping the culture of the community as much as it's an idea of white saviorism, right? You have a lot of folks who are white who move into these communities, trying to improve these communities, and end up having negative side effects because adversely it affects the culture and it shifts the culture towards whiteness, right? The idea of anti-gentrifying or being more so a transplant is an idea of allowing the culture to continue rather than changing it, even if it does have positive side effects. So there's one more thing on this sheet that on this slide that I did want to mention, and it's all the way over to the left. It's a limited equity co-op, and I wanted to just briefly talk about certain solutions, right, to gentrification. We're going to focus on the bottom-up aspect because that's what we can be directly a part of. Of course, there are a number of top-down positive benefactors to these communities that are being gentrified that happen through public policy, anti-racist policy through the government, and also lobbying your city council members and mayor, right? So let's talk about these mitigations briefly. Tenants associations. If you've ever heard of a tenants association, you probably know that tenants associations are positive benefactors within these communities that offer education and protections for people that live in the communities. Let's say, for example, a developer comes into a community and wants to buy out every single house so that they can raise the equity of that house and then sell it to the highest bidder, right? This, as a side effect, is going to displace a number of people within the community, essentially shattering the culture of the community, as we mentioned earlier. So what tenants associations do is study laws of the local city and make sure that all of the tenants in the community are under explicit knowledge of these laws. For example, in Washington, D.C., there's a law called TOPA. It stands for the Tenants Opportunity to Purchase Act. And what happens is, under the DC law, landlords are required to first offer the house to the tenant that's renting it before they're able to put it on the market for anyone else who's willing to buy it. This is an example of a law that isn't commonly known, which sometimes can lead to people getting their house bought from under them without knowing that they had the opportunity to purchase it first at market value, right? If a landlord buys a house from a tenant, they can raise that equity by 10, 20, 30, up to $50,000, up to $100,000, up to $500,000, therefore stripping an economic opportunity from the tenant that's living in that house, right? This is an opportunity that sometimes goes unnoticed. Tenants associations let the tenants of these housing complexes, communities, whether it be a row house, a Section 8 apartment complex, what have you, know that they are eligible for purchasing this before it's given to the highest bidder, right? At market value. That's an extremely important thing to remember, because your house has a market value, and you can buy it at that market value, which is much cheaper than it would go for after it's renovated, right? Going back to co-ops. Co-op is a widely used word within the United States. We're going to talk specifically about limited equity co-ops. A co-op can be anything from an apartment complex that's lived in by many people to a food store, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a house that's collectively owned by the people that live in it, which has limited equity. There are a number of cities within the US who offer the option to create a limited equity co-op. What happens is there's a loan that's taken out by the collective that lives within the house. There's a clause that's written up with rules for people to pay that loan back. And many times these loans have very low interest. So in order to create a co-op, you first have to create a community land trust. So the land that the house is on essentially becomes owned by the community. It's a community land trust, which creates many protections so that it can't be bought up by these large conglomerate developers or the landlord. So essentially you purchase the house and you limit the equity that can be put on the house. So let's say we create a limited equity co-op and you put a deck on the back of the house. The price of the house, the value of the house does not raise. That's the negative aspect of limited equity co-ops. The positive aspect of limited equity co-ops is that your rent essentially never goes up if it works correctly. So you create a community land trust through the government of the city, and then essentially create a co-op with the people that live in the house. A lot of times these things are very competitive because the rent never goes up. Sometimes landlords have agreements with their tenants that if they, for example, collectively sign a lease, they don't ever have any rent increases. It's very similar to that, except it's through the government. So once you create a co-op, it's limited equity. You can't raise the equity of the house. You can't raise the value of the house, but your rent never goes up, right? That's the positive, that's the negative. Because we live in a very economical society, in our society of capitalism, it's not a very attractive offer. but it is something that can mitigate the negative effects of displacement within communities by keeping the community intact, right? Um, so we may return to limited equity co-ops if there's time in the future. But what I will say is that a community co-op, a limited equity co-op, is not limited to one house or one place. Sometimes entire blocks can be community co-ops. Sometimes there can be sporadic houses within a community that are part of the same co-op whose values stay the same while the rest of the houses in the community have values that soar, right? Therefore, the people can continue to live in their house without risk of being displaced. And a lot of times these co-ops are in effect for decades, sometimes even 100 years. In DC specifically, it's 99 years that a limited equity co-op can be valid through the DC government. Now, let's real quick talk about education. We're talking about tenants associations and how they can be beneficial to the people that live in that community. If you're a transplant and you want to be a positive benefactor of your community, there are a number of things that you can do. We already talked about getting to know your neighbors. This is the number one thing that you must do in order to help the community continue to be intact, right? It's important to get to know every and all of your neighbors in order to become a member of that community. If you don't know your neighbors, you'll never become a member of the community, and you start to lean towards that gentrifier part of the spectrum, right? When ideally we would like to be positive benefactors of our community and end up going towards that transplant side of the spectrum. So along with the tenants association counterparts, I can't stress the importance of finding counterparts, people that are already established within your community, because they do exist. It's just a heck of a job finding them. Along with counterparts, it's always important to have a community map. Why do we need a community map? We didn't know exactly what the resources in the community are. Many communities within urban America, especially low-income communities, are food deserts. There aren't any supermarkets around so that people can get healthy food for their family, right? We could talk about nutrition education at another time. That's a whole nother story. But having that community map is really important to know exactly where everything is in your community, along with vulnerable housing. We talked about vulnerable housing and vacant housing. If you have vacant houses within your community, then it's important to know where they are. If you are really educated about community co-ops and you would like to form one, right? Not to mention vulnerable housing that is at risk of being bought up by developers, effectively displacing American families to other parts of the US, ripping that community apart. So when you have your community map, you identify the vacant houses, the vulnerable houses, mark those on your community map, along with everything else, anything that is community related, local stores, community libraries, rec centers, churches. Churches are very important hubs for community development, because many of the churches in your community are still attended by people who are longtime residents of the community, effectively the historians of your community. They're the most important members of your community. It's really important that you get to know them as well as the community leaders. Next, it's important to attend community meetings. In almost every city, there's going to be a very low form of government, some kind of neighborhood committee, some type of advisory committee through the government that handles very local domestic issues within the ward or subsection of the city that you live in. It's important to attend all of those meetings just so you know exactly what's happening. It's not necessarily your responsibility to contribute to that community organization or government organization, but it's important to at least attend these meetings and stay informed about what's going on in your community, as well as finding tenants associations if they exist to know what's happening. Community organizations are a huge opportunity for a new person in a community to become a transplant rather than a gentrifier. Lastly, we already mentioned joining with local counterparts. that are interested in spreading education and doing the dirty work, right? An important part of being a transplant is doing the work that people don't necessarily want to do. That's phone banking, door-to-door, knocking, outreach, just to make sure everyone knows what community events are going on, as well as um, knowing your local community members. Now, in the time of COVID, door-to-door knocking isn't necessarily recommended, although there are a number of other ways through social media and the internet um, that you can get involved. So we talked about local organizations. Let's talk briefly about citywide organizations, all right? There are a number of regular meetings and outreach organizations that you can go to. There are housing organizations that you can attend that focus on very vulnerable parts of the city. And in these meetings, in these organizations, many of them which are NGOs and 501c3s, which are essentially nonprofit organizations, you can learn a lot. There's a lot of political education, popular education, and networking through these communities, right? Many of these communities have local events that you can attend on the regular. One of the most basic of these events outside of regular meetings are freedom schools. Freedom schools are essentially seminars that are put together for local community members that live in vulnerable housing in order for them to become educated on the local laws of the city and their rights as tenants. Tenants have rights. A lot of times these rights are not widely known, right? They're not widely publicized. Many times you'll go to a city's website and it'll kind of be a web page of confusion. Very difficult to find these things. They're hidden on purpose so that money can be made in these communities where development is happening. Aside from freedom schools, there are larger meetings that can be organized called people's assemblies. Now, people's assemblies are very important for communities as they are essentially information sessions for the whole of the city, many times ranging from 100 to 500 people, so that people can know their rights, as well as give their grievances to these NGOs that are working for fair and equal housing. Not just equal housing, but equitable housing, right? Of course, again, it's very difficult to create these seminars during the time of COVID, but it's always important to remember that these things are very important to prevent gentrification from happening and displacing people, right? Gentrification is inevitable, right? We're not going to be able to prevent every form of gentrification in a society that's dependent upon a capitalist economy that's fueled off creating capital and making money, therefore creating a cycle of money making, right? But it's always important that people are educated and know their rights so that if they are at risk of being displaced, they can at least make an educated decision of whether they want to consciously leave the place that they're living or stay in the place they're at and fight, right? Again, there are a lot of people, especially BIPOC people BIPOC folks who are vulnerable at getting kicked out just because of the history of the United States. It's always important to remember that in a racist society, even if our entire society didn't have a single racist person, we would still have racism because of the effects of the policy of the past. So it's important to lobby for anti-racist policy from the top down, right? As well as your role as a local community member. You have to know the laws. Knowing the laws is very important for top-down change in order to create anti-racist policy within your local government. Right? When I say local government, I mean city government and state government. These are the laws that affect you the most. So when getting to know your laws, it's always important to also know the people that are representing you within your city council, within your mayoral office, and within your state government. These are the folks that you could potentially call if you want anti-racist policy to thrive and continue within our government, because this is what we need in order to create an equitable society for everyone so that everyone has a chance to gain fair capital, right? If we're going to continue with a capitalist society, we need equitable solutions so that people have a fair chance, right? They say, I believe it was MLK that once said, how can you tell a man to pull himself up by his bootstraps when you don't have boots, when he doesn't have boots, right? It's important to make sure that everyone has boots and that they fit so that they have a fair chance in order to thrive in this American society. So what do we do now? We have all of this raw information in front of us. And as psychologists, we definitely have a role to play in continuing inclusion and equity within our society. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Dr. Bargdill, who will talk briefly about the role of psychologists within our society.
Well, thank you, Anthony. I mean, I think there's some very important things that you brought up here. And one is that, you know, I think one of the roles of the psychologist is to become familiar with the history of some of the racist policies that the United States has been enacting for generations and generations. And that's really an important aspect, and one of the things that you're bringing, helping us with here today, which is when someone says this, there's systemic racism in the United States. This is what they are talking about. The table has been slanted for 150 years after the Civil War against, you know, people of color in terms of owning their own home. And as you may know, the best way to build, you know, wealth is through the ownership of your house. That's the major way that people, you know, accumulate wealth, by owning, not renting, and then handing their house over to their children, who then can sell it or live in it themselves. So if we have a system that is purposefully stopping folks from owning their own house and forcing them to rent, then it is a way, in a sense, to keep people economically disadvantaged. And that's, so knowing the history a little bit about this is very significant. Being forced to move out of your you know, house or city that you are comfortable in is also tremendously stressful. Anyone who has moved once knows how stressful it is to move out and move all your stuff and relocate yourself. And that's stressful when you're willingly doing it. And now, if you are being kicked out, so to speak, then that's even more stressful. It's one of the things I think is very important is we're going to see a lot of this in the upcoming year. With COVID-19, we know that there's people who can't afford their rent. We know people who are, you know, behind on some of their mortgage payment, their rent payment, and we're going to see a lot of displacement after the virus is complete. So not that it's going to be complete, but this is also going to cause a huge housing issue as you know, people haven't paid their mortgages, landlords haven't paid their mortgages. If you haven't paid rent in 3 months, are you going to be forced to pay it all at one time? You know, so there's a lot of things that are going to be coming down, you know, with housing in the near future. And I think psychologists really, you know, need to, you know, take this seriously and do some research about how powerful housing issues are, and what a stress it is to be facing being kicked out. It's because you're going to see a lot of it in the post-COVID world. So these are things that I don't think we ordinarily think of as a personal problem, but certainly housing, I think, is going to be something that you see happening more and more in the future. And the other thing I really appreciate Anthony talking about, this is something very near and dear to, I think, Division 32, the Society of Humanistic Psychology, is how to build community, or how to be part of a community. I know psychologists often think about the individual, but one of the things that I think we sometimes struggle to teach our children is how to be a community member, and sometimes you can live in a neighborhood and not even know your neighbors, and this is not building community, right? So to think seriously about what we mean when we say community, and what we have to do. You just to live in a house doesn't mean you're a community member. It means that you're a resident, right? So a community member is somebody who is volunteering, attempting to meet people, and also make the neighborhood a better place. And so I think both of those points are very, very significant for this presentation. That's all I have for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bargdill. So that concludes the presentation. On this very last slide, I've put our contact information. Always feel free to send any of us an email if you have any questions about anything that we discussed here, or if you have any statements or corrections that you'd like to give. This is a topic that's not very frequently talked about, and not necessarily studied very often. So sometimes resources can be scarce on the psychological effects of gentrification. It's a continuing conversation that we need to continue having. So any kind of questions or comments are always appreciated. And that's all I have for you. Thank you very much for listening today. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.